October 1944. Peleliu Island. Corporal James Mitchell hit the Japanese soldier exactly where he was trained to, center mass. Again and again. It didn't matter. The man kept charging. At 15 yards, Mitchell knew the truth every Marine in the Pacific had already learned the hard way. The M1 Carbine could hit, but it could not stop. That failure was getting Americans killed. So Mitchell loaded a magazine marked with red stenciling. No briefing, no explanation. Just a warning not to waste it. He fired once. The attack ended immediately. Not because the bullet penetrated deeper, but because it burned. What Mitchell used that night was the M27 Incendiary Cartridge, a round designed not just to wound, but to end close-quarters combat on impact. By late 1944, Japanese soldiers were absorbing 4 to 5 carbine hits and continuing to fight. The Marine Corps didn't need better marksmanship. It needed a weapon that stopped movement instantly. The M27 did exactly that. Inside the bullet was a magnesium-based incendiary core that ignited on contact, burning at 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit inside the body. The effect was immediate and unforgettable. More than 187 million rounds were produced in less than a year. American casualties dropped. Enemy attacks collapsed. And Japanese troops gave the ammunition a name that spread faster than any report: Sky Fire. We're 18. But the weapon solved one problem by creating another. Marines who used it carried the results with them long after the fighting stopped. So did the Pentagon. That is why the M27 was classified for 34 years, longer than the atomic bomb. This is the story of the round that saved thousands of American lives and forced the U.S. military to ask how far a weapon can go before the cost becomes unbearable. The problem did not begin on Peleliu. Peleliu only exposed it. By the autumn of 1944, the M1 Carbine was everywhere in the Pacific. More than 6 million had been issued to American forces, Marines, Army units, radiomen, scouts, officers. It was light. It was easy to carry. And on paper, it was adequate. In combat, it was not. After-action reports from earlier battles told the same story again and again. At Tarawa, Marines documented dozens of incidents where Japanese soldiers absorbed multiple carbine hits and continued fighting. At Saipan, medical examiners found enemy bodies with an average of more than 4 carbine wounds, men who had remained mobile long enough to kill or wound Americans before collapsing. The issue was not accuracy. The issue was time. Standard .30 carbine ammunition fired a 110-grain full metal jacket bullet at roughly 1,990 feet per second. It penetrated cleanly, too cleanly. The round passed through muscle and soft tissue without transferring enough energy to cause immediate incapacitation. Unless it struck the central nervous system or caused catastrophic bleeding, the enemy often had several seconds, sometimes longer, before losing the ability to fight. In close-quarters combat, seconds were fatal. By mid-1944, Japanese tactics had evolved to exploit this weakness. Large-scale banzai charges were fading. In their place came fortified cave systems, night infiltration attacks, and sudden close-range assaults where distance collapsed faster than reaction time. Many attackers were chemically stimulated before combat. Others were simply conditioned to ignore pain and continue forward regardless of injury. The result was a battlefield dynamic where being hit no longer guaranteed safety. American Marines learned to fear the gap between impact and effect. Confidence in a weapon is not optional in combat. It is psychological armor. When that confidence erodes, hesitation follows. And hesitation kills. Reports sent back through ordnance channels began to stack up, not requests for new rifles, requests for something more basic, a way to stop an enemy immediately. The obvious alternatives were already known. The M1 Garand delivered far greater stopping power, but production could not meet demand across multiple theaters. The Thompson submachine gun worked at close range, but weighed nearly twice as much as the carbine when loaded. In tropical conditions, With Marines already carrying 70 to 80 pounds of gear, weight mattered. Firepower alone was not the solution. The problem lay in the ammunition itself. Somewhere inside the U.S. Army's ordnance system, someone remembered a technology that had never been intended for infantry combat: incendiary ammunition. For years, aircraft machine guns had used incendiary rounds designed to ignite fuel tanks and aircraft structures. These bullets did not rely solely on penetration. They relied on chemistry. When they struck, they burned. At Frankfurt Arsenal, an engineer named Theodor Halpern began asking a question that few others were willing to put on paper. What if the same principle could be applied to the M1 Carbine? Not to create a larger wound, not to increase penetration, but to ensure that when a target was hit at close range, it stopped moving immediately. The concept was simple. The implications were not. Halpern proposed a lighter bullet with an incendiary core, one that would destabilize on impact and ignite inside the wound channel. The goal was not prolonged suffering. It was instant loss of combat effectiveness. The proposal moved quickly. By the summer of 1944, experimental production was authorized. By early fall, shipments of the new ammunition, marked with red stenciling and issued under strict control, began reaching frontline units. Most Marines were never told what it was, only when to use it. And on a coral outcrop on Peleliu, with a charging enemy closing the distance, Corporal James Mitchell discovered exactly what it did. What happened on Peleliu was not an exception. It was confirmation. Across the Pacific, American units were reporting the same pattern under different names and different islands. The enemy did not need to be untouched to remain dangerous. He only needed a few seconds of motion. Those seconds were killing Americans. Medical officers began noticing it first. Enemy casualties arrived at aid stations late, not because the wounds were minor, but because the men had remained mobile long after being hit. Autopsies told a quiet, disturbing story. Multiple entrance wounds, limited tissue disruption, and no immediate shutdown of the body's ability to act. The .30 carbine round was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It penetrated, it exited, and too often, it left the fight unfinished. At Saipan, examiners recorded an average of more than 4 carbine wounds per enemy body. At Tarawa, after-action reports listed dozens of engagements where Japanese soldiers continued advancing despite taking multiple hits. Not minutes, seconds, but in close combat, seconds were enough. Japanese commanders adapted quickly. Cave networks were reinforced. Night assaults became more frequent. The goal was no longer to win prolonged firefights, but to collapse distance and force Americans into blade range. Many attackers were conditioned to ignore pain. Some were chemically stimulated before assaults. Others simply accepted death as secondary to closing the gap. The result was a battlefield environment where marksmanship alone could not guarantee survival. American forces understood the implication immediately. If stopping power was unreliable, then every engagement became a gamble. Ordnance officers began receiving formal complaints, not emotional letters, technical reports. The problem was defined clearly. The M1 Carbine could not consistently incapacitate a determined enemy at close range. Solutions were evaluated and dismissed in rapid succession. Issuing more M1 Garand rifles was ideal in theory, impossible in practice. Production capacity was already stretched across Europe and the Pacific. Thompson submachine guns performed well, but at a cost. Fully loaded, they weighed nearly twice as much as a carbine. In jungle heat, weight was not a minor inconvenience. It was exhaustion. Selective fire carbines helped marginally. More rounds downrange increased the odds, but did not change the underlying problem. The ammunition still failed to deliver immediate effect. The Marine Corps did not need more bullets. It needed a different result. Somewhere inside the Army's ordnance system, attention shifted away from ballistics and toward chemistry. Incendiary ammunition had been part of American arsenals since before the war. Aircraft machine guns used it to ignite fuel tanks and structural components. These rounds were not designed to kill pilots. They were designed to burn targets from the inside. The concept had never been applied to infantry combat for a simple reason: the implications were uncomfortable. At Frankfurt Arsenal, Theodor Halpern revisited the idea anyway. His proposal did not promise greater penetration. It promised something else: immediate loss of function. A lighter bullet would travel faster. A thinner jacket would deform more violently. An incendiary core would ignite upon impact, introducing heat and chemical reaction directly into the wound channel. The intent was not prolonged damage. It was instant incapacitation. If the enemy could not move, he could not close distance. If he could not close distance, he could not kill. By July 1944, the Pentagon approved experimental development. By August, limited production began. By early fall, shipments were being prepared for units engaged in the most dangerous form of combat. The ammunition was designated M27. It looked nearly identical to standard 30 carbine rounds except for one detail: a red marked tip. No public explanation accompanied its distribution. No training circulars, no speeches. Only a quiet directive: issue under authorization. Use when necessary. Most Marines did not know what the rounds were designed to do. They only knew what happened when they were fired, and word spread quickly. When the red-tipped rounds appeared, attacks stopped differently. Not slowly, not eventually, immediately. The battlefield was about to change, not because the enemy was hit harder, but because, for the first time, being hit meant the fight was over. The M27 was not introduced with fanfare. It arrived quietly, folded into existing supply lines, issued in limited quantities to units facing the worst conditions: night fighting, cave clearing, close-range defense. On the outside, the cartridge looked ordinary. Same dimensions, same overall length. It fed into standard M1 and M1A1 carbines without modification. That similarity was deliberate. The difference was inside. The M27 used an 81-grain bullet, nearly 30 grains lighter than standard carbine ammunition. That reduction in weight increased velocity, pushing the round faster downrange and shortening barrel time. Accuracy improved slightly as a result, but accuracy was never the point. The bullet's jacket was thinner, especially at the nose. It was designed to fail on impact. Inside that jacket sat a compact incendiary core composed of a magnesium-based mixture. At its base was a small percussion element similar in principle to a primer positioned to be crushed when the bullet deformed. When the M27 struck tissue, the sequence happened almost instantly. The jacket collapsed. The percussion element ignited. The incendiary compound burned at temperatures exceeding 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The reaction occurred inside the wound channel. Unlike aircraft incendiary rounds designed to ignite fuel tanks, the M27's charge was smaller, just enough to introduce intense heat and chemical reaction without destroying the bullet before impact. The effect was not subtle. Field examinations showed wound channels several times larger than those caused by standard ammunition. Thermal damage extended beyond the path of the bullet itself. But the most important outcome was neither penetration nor destruction. It was immediate incapacitation. Men hit with M27 ammunition stopped moving, not because they were always killed instantly, but because the combined shock, pain, and trauma overwhelmed the body's ability to continue forward. In close combat, that distinction mattered more than lethality. The first widespread use came almost accidentally. On Peleliu, after the initial encounters, Marines began exchanging magazines. Red-tipped rounds moved from man to man with brief explanations and no debate. When night attacks followed, the difference was unmistakable. Engagements that previously dragged into hand-to-hand range ended abruptly. Attackers fell where they were hit. Others hesitated. Some retreated without closing the distance. The change was immediate enough to be noticed even by hardened veterans. After-action reports reflected the shift in tone. Language changed from frustration to certainty. Where earlier reports described enemies continuing to advance, new reports noted immediate neutralization, and cessation of movement. Working 5-ness. Within hours, word spread through entire regiments. The red-tipped rounds worked. As dawn broke over Peleliu, Marines who had received the M27 had already used it. By the next night, units requested more. The effect was not limited to individual firefights. In one engagement, a small number of M27 rounds ignited an enemy ammunition cache hidden inside a cave complex. Secondary explosions followed. Positions that had resisted days of assault were abandoned within minutes. The weapon was proving effective beyond its original intent, but it came with instructions learned the hard way. Marines discovered that mixing M27 and standard ammunition in the same magazine caused reliability issues. The difference in bullet weight altered recoil dynamics. Best practice quickly became loading entire magazines with one type only. Recoil itself felt different. Not heavier, sharper. Experienced shooters adapted quickly, adjusting grip and cadence. Follow-up shots became faster. The learning curve was short. By the end of the first day of widespread use, the pattern was undeniable. Units equipped with M27 ammunition experienced fewer close-range breakthroughs. Enemy assaults lost momentum. Casualties dropped. Just as importantly, enemy behavior changed. Japanese soldiers who had previously relied on closing distance began engaging from farther away. Some attacks simply did not come. For the first time in months, American Marines were dictating the terms of close combat. The M27 did not make the war easier, but it changed how it was fought. And in doing so, it introduced a new problem, one that had nothing to do with production, logistics, or tactics. It forced everyone involved to confront what kind of weapon they had just unleashed. The impact of the M27 was not measured in anecdotes for long. It showed up in numbers. As reports accumulated from Peleliu and nearby positions, analysts began comparing engagements that looked identical on paper. Same terrain, same unit strength, same mission except for one variable, the ammunition. In firefights where standard .30 carbine rounds were used, enemy attackers often closed distance before collapsing. American casualties followed a predictable curve. Initial contact, brief exchange, then sudden close-quarters chaos. Where M27 ammunition was present, that curve flattened. Rounds to incapacitation dropped sharply. Enemy personnel struck by incendiary rounds stopped fighting immediately in the vast majority of cases. Not because they were always killed on the spot, but because they lost the ability to advance. That single change altered the entire rhythm of combat. Night infiltration attacks, once the most feared tactic, lost their effectiveness. An attacker set ablaze illuminated his surroundings, exposing movement and breaking momentum. What had been darkness and confusion turned into visibility and control. In one documented engagement, 3 enemy soldiers were stopped during a single nighttime approach. The brief flashes from the impacts provided enough light for surrounding Marines to identify additional targets. A raid that would have succeeded days earlier collapsed within seconds. The result was decisive. 12 enemy casualties. No American losses. This pattern repeated. Within 48 hours of the first widespread use, Japanese behavior shifted noticeably. Assaults that relied on speed and proximity slowed. Some ceased entirely. Captured documents and intercepted communications began referencing a new American weapon, one described not in technical terms, but experiential ones. A fire bullet. Even with it, a round that made close combat unacceptable. Orders circulated advising troops to avoid engagement at short range. Maximum distance was emphasized. Caves that once served as launch points became liabilities when ignition spread within confined spaces. For American forces, the implications were immediate. When the enemy was forced to engage from farther away, the battlefield shifted into familiar territory. Artillery, machine guns, air support, advantages that had been muted in jungle fighting returned with force. Statistical analysis followed quickly. Units equipped with M27 ammunition reported significantly lower casualty rates in comparable operations. In several engagements, American losses dropped by more than half. Enemy withdrawal rates increased. Suppression was achieved faster, with fewer rounds expended. The numbers told a story commanders could not ignore. But the data did not capture everything. Medics and corpsmen began submitting a different kind of report. They wrote about the aftermath. Enemy casualties struck by incendiary rounds often did not die quietly. Burning continued for minutes after impact. The sights and smells lingered. American personnel were forced to witness it. Some Marines asked to be reassigned away from positions where M27 ammunition was issued. Others continued to use it without comment, then struggled afterward. Medical officers documented symptoms that went beyond fatigue or combat stress. Nightmares, aversion, emotional numbness. The weapon was saving lives, and it was leaving marks that were not physical. Chaplains received questions they had no training to answer. Is this different? Is this worse? Does necessity justify the method? There were no immediate responses. From a tactical standpoint, the answer was clear. The M27 worked. From a human standpoint, the situation was less comfortable. By late October 1944, demand for the ammunition outpaced supply. Frontline units requested priority allocations. Scouts, pointmen, and defensive positions received the first shipments. Logistics officers struggled to keep up. Production expanded rapidly, but constraints remained. The incendiary core required careful assembly. Quality control rejected a significant percentage of rounds. Storage conditions had to be controlled to prevent degradation. Even so, millions of rounds moved forward. With each shipment, the battlefield changed a little more. Japanese commanders adapted again, but the options were narrowing. Close combat, once a strength, had become a liability. Longer-range engagements exposed troops to overwhelming firepower. The M27 had not ended the war, but it had removed one of the enemy's most dangerous advantages, and in doing so, it forced the American military to confront a reality it had not planned for. The most effective solution they had found came with consequences no spreadsheet could fully measure. Those consequences were about to reach far beyond Peleliu. The weapon worked. That was no longer in question. What no one had prepared for was what came with it. As M27 ammunition spread across frontline units, the reports began to change in tone. Zhao. They were no longer only about outcomes and numbers. They were about reactions. Medics were the first to notice the difference. Enemy casualties, struck by incendiary rounds, did not resemble wounds they had treated before. The injuries were catastrophic. But it was not only the physical damage that stood out. Burning continued after the fight was over. Corpsmen described flames persisting for minutes. Uniforms consumed. Flesh blackened. The smell lingering long after the position had been secured. American Marines were forced to stand over it. Some had fired the round, others had not. All of them saw the result. In medical logs, language began to shift. Not just wounded or killed, but phrases like disturbing, prolonged, psychologically distressing. These were not emotional letters home. They were official observations. Symptoms followed. Nightmares, irritability, avoidance behavior. In some cases, outright refusal to load M27 ammunition when given the choice. These were not new problems in war, but they were appearing with unusual speed and concentration among units that had used the incendiary rounds most heavily. Chaplains were drawn in next. Men began asking questions that had no clear answers. Not about tactics, about guilt. Was this different from killing with a rifle? Was it worse to burn than to bleed? Did necessity erase responsibility? The chaplains could not point to doctrine. There was no scripture for this, no precedent they could reference. The questions moved upward. Medical officers forwarded their observations. Commanders added context. Some reports argued that the psychological toll was a necessary burden, no different from other brutal realities of combat. Others disagreed. They noted that Marines who had endured months of fighting showed sudden changes after exposure to M27 effects, not weakness. Disruption. The issue reached the Pentagon quietly. Legal staff were tasked with a narrow question. Did the M27 violate existing laws of war? The answer came back carefully worded. The ammunition was designed for immediate incapacitation. Its incendiary effect served a legitimate military purpose. It was not intended to cause suffering for its own sake. Legally, it was permissible. That did not end the discussion. Enemy propaganda seized the opportunity almost immediately. Broadcasts referenced American fire weapons. End quote. Stories, some exaggerated, some invented, circulated, describing Marines haunted by what they had used. Even when the claims were false, the effect was real. The existence of the weapon itself became a psychological tool. Within American ranks, silence became the default response. Marines did not talk openly about the ammunition, not out of shame, but because the subject invited questions no one wanted to answer in the middle of a war. Those who used it most often said the least. Production, meanwhile, continued to climb. Millions of rounds moved through supply chains under strict control. Usage was prioritized for scouts, point men, and defensive positions where immediate stopping power mattered most. Commanders understood the trade-off. The M27 saved lives. That fact was undeniable. But it did so by introducing an experience many of the men carrying it would never forget. The military had created a solution to a tactical problem and uncovered a psychological one it could not easily solve. By late 1944, the question was no longer whether the M27 should be used. It was how long its effects on both sides of the trigger would last. And that question would follow the ammunition long after the fighting moved on from Peleliu. The M27 had proven its value in combat, but value did not make it simple to use. Almost immediately, limitations began to surface not on the battlefield, but in everything surrounding it. The ammunition demanded careful handling. Unlike standard .30 carbine rounds, the M27 could not be treated casually. Its thin jacket and internal incendiary components were sensitive to impact and heat. Rounds that could survive rough handling in a rucksack were suddenly unreliable. Marines learned this through experience. Dropped magazines occasionally produced deformed rounds. Those deformations caused feeding failures or prevented ignition on impact. Inspection became routine. Before patrols, men checked each magazine by feel and sight. Any round with a dented tip or damaged jacket was discarded. In combat conditions, that extra step mattered. So did storage. The incendiary compound inside the M27 degraded when exposed to sustained heat and humidity. In the tropical Pacific, that was unavoidable. Supply officers were forced to adapt. M27. Ammunition could not sit indefinitely in forward positions. Stockpiles had to be rotated regularly. Climate-controlled storage, normally reserved for food and medical supplies, was repurposed for ammunition. Refrigerated cargo ships were converted to carry red-tipped crates. Underground bunkers were used whenever possible. Even then, shelf life was limited. The weapon that saved lives at the front demanded protection long before it ever reached the line. Operational issues followed. Marines discovered quickly that mixing M27 and standard ammunition in the same magazine caused problems. The lighter incendiary bullet generated a different recoil impulse. Loaded behind heavier rounds, it sometimes failed to cycle the action reliably. Best practice became rigid. One magazine, one type of ammunition. This reduced flexibility. In fast-moving fights, it forced decisions in advance: which magazine to load, which to hold back. Recoil characteristics also differed. The M27 did not kick harder, but faster. The impulse was sharper, requiring adjustment in grip and cadence. Veteran shooters adapted. Newer Marines took longer. Maintenance demands increased as well. The higher chamber pressure of the M27 placed additional stress on the carbine's gas system. Armorers began reporting accelerated wear on gas pistons and operating slides. Carbines firing large quantities of incendiary rounds required more frequent part replacement. Barrel wear, unexpectedly, proved less severe than predicted, but residue from the incendiary compound accumulated quickly. Cleaning schedules tightened. Weapons that were not cleaned after extended firing experienced extraction failures. Field manuals were updated quietly. Clean more often. Inspect more closely. Safety concerns emerged. In rare incidents, loaded magazines dropped from height ignited outside the weapon. The rounds did not explode, but they burned intensely. Entire magazines were consumed in seconds. No injuries resulted, but the message was clear. Handling protocols were revised. Loaded magazines were no longer carried loosely. Cargo pockets were prohibited. Unsecured transport was restricted. Every advantage the M27 provided came with friction. Meanwhile, the enemy attempted to adapt. Intelligence reports described Japanese efforts to counter the incendiary effect. Uniforms soaked in water. Multiple layers of clothing worn in hopes of absorbing impact energy. The attempts failed. Water flashed to steam. Clothing burned longer, not shorter. Intermediate barriers, branches, wooden fortifications sometimes disrupted ignition, but not reliably. The uncertainty worked against the attacker. Even when the M27 failed to ignite, the threat alone altered behavior. Japanese units began avoiding close engagement entirely when possible. That shift remained one of the M27's most powerful effects. Yet for American planners, the growing list of complications could not be ignored. The ammunition was effective, but it was demanding. It required logistics discipline, maintenance discipline, and emotional discipline. The question facing commanders was no longer whether the M27 worked. It was whether it could be sustained technically, psychologically, and politically at the scale the war now demanded. That question would soon be answered far beyond Peleliu, as the ammunition moved into larger campaigns where its impact and its consequences would multiply. The clearest measure of the M27's impact did not come from American reports. It came from the enemy. Within days of the first large-scale use, Japanese behavior on the battlefield began to shift in ways that surprised even experienced intelligence officers. Not subtly, not gradually, deliberately. Intercepted radio traffic started referencing a new American weapon. Descriptions varied, but the message was consistent. Close engagement was no longer acceptable. Japanese field orders emphasized distance. Engage from range. Avoid rushing positions known to be held by Marines carrying the incendiary rounds. This represented a fundamental reversal. For years, Japanese infantry doctrine had relied on closing distance, aggressive movement, night attacks, sudden assaults designed to negate American firepower advantages. Now, that doctrine was failing. Units that attempted close-range attacks against M27-equipped Marines suffered disproportionate losses. The psychological shock of seeing men ignite on impact spread faster than formal orders. Survivors did not need instruction. They adapted on instinct. Captured documents reflected the change in tone. References to honorable close combat disappeared. They were replaced by warnings. Better to be hit by a normal bullet than burned alive. This shift rippled outward. Banzai charges, already declining by late 1944, nearly vanished in sectors where M27 use was heavy. Cave defenders abandoned forward positions sooner. Infiltration attacks slowed or stopped altogether. The enemy was still fighting, but on different terms. Those terms favored American forces. When Japanese units pulled back and engaged from longer distances, they entered a battlefield the United States dominated. Artillery coverage expanded. Machine gun fields overlapped. Air support operated with fewer constraints. Engagements that would have devolved into brutal close-quarters combat became standoff encounters. American casualty rates dropped. Enemy losses climbed. Operational research teams began quantifying the shift. Comparative analysis of firefights showed consistent trends. Enemy withdrawal rates increased sharply when M27 ammunition was present. American units advanced farther with fewer casualties. Positions that had resisted for days fell in hours. The M27 did not simply stop individual attackers, it reshaped the battlefield. In the Philippines, similar patterns emerged. Japanese defenders initially attempted close defense. After M27 distribution reached frontline units, tactics changed. Engagement distances increased. Enemy units exposed themselves while repositioning. American firepower exploited the movement. Casualty ratios shifted decisively. What had been a weapon of last resort became a catalyst for strategic advantage. But the enemy did not stop adapting. Japanese intelligence officers attempted to identify limits. Reports suggested the incendiary effect diminished at longer ranges. Orders emphasized engagement beyond that threshold. The strategy reduced the weapon's direct effect but created new vulnerabilities. Longer-range fighting reduced Japanese ability to exploit terrain and surprise. American artillery and air assets filled the gap. In attempting to escape one threat, Japanese forces stepped into another. The M27's influence extended beyond immediate engagements. It altered planning. American commanders began allocating incendiary ammunition not just to stop attacks, but to shape enemy behavior. Its presence alone became a deterrent. Japanese units learned to identify red-tipped rounds. They learned which American units carried them. They learned to avoid those units when possible. Fear became a factor in tactical decision-making. This did not break the Japanese army, but it constrained it. The war did not end because of the M27, but the nature of the fighting changed. For American forces, the advantage was undeniable. For Japanese forces, the cost was immediate. And for the men who carried the red-tipped rounds, the implications deepened. They were no longer just fighting an enemy. They were wielding a weapon that altered behavior, doctrine, and morale. That level of influence came with attention from higher command. Strategists recognized the opportunity. Policymakers began considering the consequences. The M27 had moved beyond being a battlefield solution. It had become a factor in how the war itself was being shaped. And that raised a question the military could no longer avoid. If a single type of ammunition could force an enemy to abandon its preferred way of fighting, what did that mean for the future of warfare? The answer would not be decided on the front lines. What began as a limited solution on a small island did not stay small for long. By late 1944, M27 ammunition was no longer confined to isolated engagements. It was moving into campaigns, measured not in platoons, but in divisions. In the Philippines, American forces encountered a familiar pattern at first. Japanese defenders relied on close-range ambushes, sudden counterattacks, and fortified positions designed to collapse distance quickly. For weeks, progress was slow and costly. Then, the red-tipped ammunition arrived. Units tasked with clearing urban areas and jungle approaches received priority allocations. Point men and scouts carried the first magazines. Commanders watched carefully. The results mirrored Peleliu, but on a larger scale. Close-range counterattacks lost momentum almost immediately. Defenders withdrew sooner. Positions that had required repeated assaults fell after initial contact. Reports described the same phenomenon appearing again and again. Enemy personnel hit with incendiary rounds ceased movement instantly, and those nearby reacted differently once they saw the effect. The change was not limited to casualties. It was behavioral. Japanese units began abandoning interior positions rather than defending them to the last man. They repositioned to longer ranges, exposing themselves during movement. American firepower punished the shift. By early 1945, M27 ammunition was being shipped in massive quantities. Production expanded at multiple facilities. Millions of rounds moved through the Pacific supply network each month. Distribution priorities shifted toward units conducting cave clearing, urban fighting, and nighttime defense. The ammunition had become an operational tool. Its most significant test came during preparations for Okinawa. Planners understood what awaited them: dense fortifications, extensive cave networks, an enemy prepared to fight at close range. Before the landings, units expected to face the heaviest resistance received large quantities of M27 ammunition, not as a replacement for standard rounds, but as a supplement reserved for moments when stopping power mattered most. When the campaign began, the pattern repeated. Japanese forces attempted aggressive defense in the early days. Then the reports changed. Engagement distances increased. Direct assaults declined. Positions were abandoned after initial contact. American casualty rates dropped compared to earlier island campaigns of similar intensity. Enemy losses increased as defenders exposed themselves while repositioning. Operational analysts tracked the data closely. The numbers were consistent. Where M27 ammunition was used heavily, American units experienced fewer close-quarters breakthroughs. Enemy withdrawal rates rose. Advance speed increased. The ammunition was not decisive by itself, but it amplified every other advantage American forces already possessed. Artillery strikes became more effective when the enemy could not remain concealed. Air support operated with fewer restrictions. Machine gun positions dominated open approaches. The M27 had reached its peak influence not as a secret experiment, but as a force multiplier integrated into large-scale warfare. Yet, as its use expanded, so did the scrutiny. Senior commanders began asking questions that went beyond tactics. How long could this be sustained? What would be the reaction after the war? What precedent was being set? The ammunition was doing exactly what it was designed to do, but its effects were impossible to hide. Enemy propaganda amplified the imagery. References to burning bullets appeared in broadcasts and leaflets. Even exaggerated claims reinforced the weapon's reputation. Within American ranks, the silence deepened. Marines used the ammunition when ordered. They did not discuss it afterward. The M27 had become both a solution and a liability. It shortened fights, it saved lives, and it created records that few wanted preserved. By the summer of 1945, the ammunition was everywhere it was needed, and nowhere it could be ignored. As the war moved toward its end, attention shifted away from how the M27 performed and toward what would happen once the fighting stopped. Because weapons that change how wars are fought rarely disappear quietly, and the M27 was about to leave behind a legacy that would outlast the war itself. The war ended faster than anyone expected. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. The fighting stopped, and suddenly, the question was no longer how the M27 would be used, but what would be done with it. Across the Pacific, enormous quantities of incendiary ammunition remained in circulation. Millions of red-tipped rounds sat in depots, aboard ships, and in forward storage bunkers. They were effective. They were proven. And they were a problem. During the war, necessity had overridden discomfort. After the war, necessity disappeared. The War Department faced an uncomfortable reality. The M27 was not just another type of ammunition. It was a weapon whose effects could not be easily explained, justified, or forgotten. Reports from medical officers, chaplains, and commanders were now read in a different light. What had been tolerated in wartime began to look dangerous in peace. The first decision was containment. Remaining stocks were ordered consolidated under armed guard. Shipments moved quietly back to the United States, primarily to Lake City Army Ammunition Plant and Frankfurt Arsenal. Forward units were instructed to turn in all remaining M27 ammunition. No public announcements were made. No explanations were given. The second decision was destruction. Controlled burning sites were designated. Large quantities of ammunition were destroyed under supervision. The process was methodical and deliberately undocumented in public records. Some rounds were kept. Most were eliminated. At the same time, classification orders were issued. In September 1945, discussion of the M27 was restricted. By January 1946, the classification level increased. Technical specifications, production figures, and tactical employment reports were sealed. The reasoning was not singular. There were political concerns. The United States was positioning itself as a post-war stabilizing power. Acknowledging the widespread use of incendiary small arms ammunition complicated that narrative. There were legal concerns. While the M27 had been deemed permissible under existing laws of war, international scrutiny was inevitable. Future conflicts would invite questions no one wanted to answer, and there were moral concerns. Unlike artillery or bombing, the M27 personalized its effects. It forced those who used it to witness the outcome directly. That reality did not translate well into official histories. The decision was made quietly and decisively. The M27 would not be discussed. It would not be celebrated. It would not be taught. It would be erased. For the men who had carried it, the silence was not surprising. Many had already chosen not to speak about it. The weapon had solved problems they did not want to revisit. For engineers and ordnance officers, the outcome was more complicated. The M27 represented a technical success. It had achieved its objective with precision, and yet its very effectiveness ensured it would never be embraced again. Research continued out of sight. Test programs explored similar concepts under different calibers and configurations. None advanced to production. Each was halted for the same reasons that ended the M27. Too effective, too visible, too difficult to justify. By the late 1940 seconds, the ammunition had vanished from inventories. By the 1950 seconds, it was absent from Doctrine. By the 1960 seconds, it existed only in sealed files and fading memories. The classification held. For decades, official histories of the Pacific War made no mention of incendiary carbine ammunition. Casualty analyses omitted its influence. Tactical discussions bypassed it entirely. The silence was deliberate. It was easier to remember victories than the tools that made them possible. Easier to honor sacrifice than to explain the methods used to reduce it. The M27 had done exactly what it was created to do. It ended fights quickly. It saved lives. And because of that, it was buried. Not because it failed, but because it worked too well. The files would remain closed for more than 30 years. And when they finally opened, the world would learn that one of the most effective weapons of the Pacific War had been hidden not from the enemy, but from history itself. For more than 3 decades, the M27 existed only as a rumor. It did not appear in museums. It did not appear in official histories. It did not appear in training manuals or public archives. Then, quietly, the files began to open. In the late 1970 seconds, pressure from declassification laws forced the release of long-sealed wartime records. Technical specifications emerged first. Production figures followed, then fragments of operational analysis. What was missing were the voices. The documents described performance. They described efficiency. They described outcomes. They did not describe what it felt like to use the ammunition. That part came later. As veterans aged, some agreed to speak carefully, often reluctantly, not to defend what they had done, not to condemn it, just to explain it. They described nights when attacks ended faster than they ever had before, moments when an enemy charge stopped instantly instead of reaching their position, the sudden silence after chaos. They also described what followed, the images that stayed, the smells that returned without warning, the feeling that something essential had shifted inside them. One Marine described the rounds as necessary and terrible in the same sentence. Another said they worked exactly as intended, and that was the problem. None of them spoke with pride. They spoke with precision. Engineers involved in the program appeared in records as well. Men who had spent their careers designing weapons systems with measurable goals, accuracy, reliability, efficiency. For them, the M27 had been a technical challenge. Solved the problem of immediate incapacitation at close range. They solved it. But even among the designers, discomfort surfaced. Private correspondence revealed doubts that never made it into official reports. Requests for reassignment. Expressions of unease. The M27 was effective, but it had crossed a line few could clearly define. The military, for its part, did not revisit the concept. Subsequent conflicts produced new weapons, new doctrines, new technologies. None returned to incendiary small arms ammunition for anti-personnel use. The decision was not written into law immediately. It emerged gradually, through policy, through directives, through silence. By the mid-1970 seconds, formal prohibitions were in place. Weapons designed specifically to ignite human beings were no longer acceptable. The M27 had become a boundary. Its influence persisted quietly. Later, ammunition designs incorporated lessons learned from its ballistics and materials without adopting its purpose. Tracer rounds, multi-purpose projectiles. Marking systems, the fire remained, but it was redirected. As more records became public, historians debated the M27's place in the war. Some focused on numbers, casualties reduced, engagements shortened. Others focused on ethics. Suffering intensified. Psychological cost increased. Both arguments missed something essential. The M27 was not a symbol, it was a response. It emerged from a battlefield where being hit was not enough to stop an enemy, where seconds decided survival, where conventional solutions had failed. It was built by people who wanted to end fights faster. It was used by people who wanted to live, and it was buried by institutions that understood what it represented. In the end, the M27 did not change the outcome of the war. It changed how certain battles were fought, and it changed the men who fought them. That is why it remained classified longer than many larger, more destructive weapons. Not because it was more powerful, but because it forced a question no one was comfortable answering. How far should effectiveness be allowed to go? For the men on Peleliu, the answer had been immediate. Stop the attack. Survive the night. For everyone who came after, the answer was slower and heavier. The M27 Incendiary Cartridge saved lives. It caused suffering, and it left behind a legacy measured not only in statistics, but in memory. Those memories were carried quietly for decades, and when they finally surfaced, they revealed a truth that wartime records alone could not capture. Some weapons end battles, others end arguments. The M27 did both. Long after the war ended, the battlefield did not disappear. It followed men home. For those who had carried the red-tipped magazines, peace arrived slowly, if it arrived at all. There were no parades for the ammunition they used, no citations that mentioned it, no questions they wanted to answer. Most veterans chose silence, not because they were ordered to, but because explanation felt impossible. How do you describe a weapon that saved your life and still wakes you at night? Some tried. They spoke about moments measured in yards and seconds, about attacks that ended before they reached the wire, about nights when the enemy stopped moving instead of closing in. They spoke less about what happened after, the smell that lingered, the images that returned without warning, the knowledge that survival had come at a price no one could share. Others never spoke at all. Their service records listed campaigns and commendations, nothing about ammunition, nothing about fire. The M27 did not follow them into civilian life as an object. It followed them as memory. Inside the military, the silence hardened into policy. By the time the Cold War reshaped doctrine and arsenals, the idea of incendiary small arms ammunition for anti-personnel use was no longer debated. It was simply absent. New weapons were developed, more precise, more powerful, more distant. None required a soldier to stand close enough to watch what happened next. That distance mattered. As conflicts changed, so did the language used to describe them. Terms like collateral damage and force multiplier replaced words that had once been spoken plainly. The M27 belonged to an earlier era, one where cause and effect were immediate and unavoidable. When historians finally pieced together its story, they found no single villain and no clear hero. They found a battlefield problem, a technical solution, and a set of consequences no one had anticipated fully. The M27 was not designed out of cruelty. It was designed out of urgency. Men were dying because being hit was not enough. The engineers who built it were not seeking to cross a line. They were trying to draw one between survival and failure. The commanders who approved it did not celebrate it. They authorized it quietly, because the alternative was watching their units be overrun, and the men who fired it did not carry it as a symbol. They carried it as insurance against seconds they could not afford to lose. In the decades that followed, debates about the weapon often focused on morality in isolation. Was it justified? Was it excessive? Those questions missed the context that created it. The M27 existed because the battlefield demanded an answer faster than doctrine could adapt. It did not ask permission. It did not wait for consensus. It appeared, did its work, and vanished. What remained was not a technology to be improved or revived. What remained was a boundary. Modern militaries would draw that boundary differently. They would invest in distance, automation, precision. They would reduce the need to stand face to face with the consequences of a single shot. But the lesson of the M27 did not disappear with it. It lingered as a warning. That effectiveness has a cost beyond statistics. That some solutions solve the immediate problem while creating a deeper one. And that the burden of those decisions always falls first and longest on the people closest to the trigger. On Peleliu, the question had been simple. Stop the attack. Survive the night. Everything else came later. History often remembers wars through numbers, maps, and outcomes. It forgets the moments when a single decision reshaped how violence felt to the people inside it. The M27 Incendiary Cartridge was one of those moments. It did not change who won the war. It changed what survival required. And for the men who lived through it, that change never truly ended when the fighting stopped.